Right, our speaker today is Geoff Kirby. Geoff is a member of Dorset Humanists, hailing from the west of the county, and this is his third talk for us. He worked as a scientist for the civil service. He retired from the civil service nearly 30 years ago, but after that he worked as a part-time consultant scientist until fully retiring in 2005. He then studied for an Open University degree in environmental sciences. And since then, he's had a very enjoyable and busy retirement, writing 9 books on a wide range of topics, including wacky and wonderful misconceptions about our universe, a copy of which is in our library. I don't know if it's a signed copy. Maybe we need to get you to sign that, Geoff, but anyway. Our lending library isn't physically out today, but the catalogue is here on the front desk if you want to have a browse to see what we've got, and mainly books on humanism, science, that kind of thing. In 2014, Geoff wrote a book, he doesn't know I'm going to say this, but he wrote a book called Breast Health and Bra Comfort. Over 80% of women wear badly fitting bras which cause discomfort and may cause serious health issues. So if that's ever been the case for you, then do buy Geoff's book on the topic. He is an expert. Sorry, Geoff.
It's all right.
Does he offer private consultants?
He does private consultants, yes, private fitting, yes,
private fitting,
especially for the vice chair, yeah.
Very discreet, yes.
When he was 82, he raised over £800 for the Motor Neurone Disease Association charity by having his 18-inch ponytail cut off. So when Geoff used to appear on our Zoom calls a couple of years ago, he'd just sort of turn round and show us his fantastic ponytail. And Geoff, I don't know how traumatic it was to have that cut off, but anyway.
Oh, it was terrible, yeah. So I had to have an anaesthetic, actually. Yeah.
Okay, well look, Geoff is one of the most cheerful people I know. I'm very pleased, Geoff, that you are a member of Dorset Humanists.
Yeah.
And today, as you know, he's going to be talking to us about a load of crap. So will you please give him a very warm welcome?
Okay. Well, good afternoon and happy Oh, I nearly said the C word. I'm so sorry. Right, the talk this afternoon is based on my book. I've got a copy over there. If anybody fancies going onto Amazon and buying it, I'm giving away all the money that I raise on that book this year.
I think we're not quite.
Okay.
We're not quite working it. What do we need to do, Phil? Try not to strangle you.
Yeah.
Do you want to just say something?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
That sound better?
Can everybody hear me? I can hear myself.
If anyone does have difficulty hearing, we've still got some seats at the front. Do move forward if you would like to. Sorry, Geoff.
That's all right. No problem. Yes, everything I raised from the book this year, I'm giving to the Motor Neurone Disease charity. So all going to a good cause. Right. Let me get my little buzzer. Just to finish off a little bit of publicity on this. The book costs £7.50 and it's on Kindle for £2.50. So, right, my research into toilets has taken me into some pretty rough places. The question that a lot of people ask me is, did Thomas Crapper actually invent the flushing toilet? Well, no, he didn't, because, get the hang of this thing, because Neolithic settlers in the Orkney Isles had indoor flushing toilets over 5,000 years ago. This picture shows a typical home from the area. Because of the hostile weather, the occupants didn't really want to leave the comfort of their stone huts to go to the loo, so the toilets were inside in a specially walled off section, and running rainwater was channeled into the toilet to wash out the waste. In Britain, in mid-Victorian times, most houses in Britain still didn't have an inside flush toilet. People went to the privy in the garden and the accumulated poo was used as a fertiliser. After 5,000 years, most people were worse off than their Neolithic ancestors. Even today, 600 million people worldwide do not have access to a personal toilet. But the Sumerians had extensive piped sewerage disposal systems in their towns over 5,000 years ago. Their design for the toilet seat is very similar to modern seats. Both have a gap at the front to allow users easy access for the purposes of personal cleaning. One important modern need for the front gap is to protect airline passengers from being sucked into the toilets if seated when the toilet's flushed. And if there's time at the end, I'll tell you some horrific stories about that. The Harappans, who lived in what is now Pakistan around 4,600 years ago, had ensuite facilities annexed to their bedrooms in which the toilets were flushed into a cesspit well away from the house. Very modern. The Egyptians had showers enclosed in drained stone trays and adjacent toilets which had wooden seats, which were particularly comfortable in those days, rather than the stone seats that everybody else had. Herodotus, who lived about 2,500 years ago, noted the unusual toilet habits of the Egyptians in that the women would stand to pee and the men would crouch down. The highly developed and sophisticated Minoan civilization had an advanced sewer disposal system in their towns and cities. The Minoans installed underground clay pipes beneath Knossos to supply fresh water and to take away sewerage and rainwater. These tapered pipes were carefully designed to fit together to create curved paths, and the cross-section was elliptical, which helped the water flow to scour out any sediment. Modern sewer pipes are also elliptical for the very same reason. So the Minoan civilization was very advanced in their engineering. At each joint between the pipes, there was a little nozzle which created a jet of liquid to clean out the next pipe. At regular intervals, there were drain pits which collected all the sediment. These were frequently cleared by hand to ensure the efficient flow of sewerage. So the Minoans really did know how to handle their sewerage. In the palace of Knossos, there were toilets with wooden seats, flushing water, and a non-return system for discharging bodily waste into the underground sewer. Not all ancient civilizations were so sophisticated, however, that the Trojans apparently just stood, pooed and peed in the street in front of everybody else. The Romans had by far the most sophisticated sewerage systems in the ancient world. It surpassed even what the average European had to put up with in the mid-1800s. Soon after the building of Rome, a huge sewerage system was installed called the Cloaca Maxima, which was looked after by the goddess Cloacina, who you see on these coins, the deity of sewers and filth. This ditty was often put on Victoria chamber pots. O Cloacina, goddess of this place, look upon thy servant with a smiling face. Sorry, get my papers unravelled. Soft and cohesive, let my offering flow, not rudely swift, not obstinately slow. The main sewer pipe under Rome was 16 feet wide, and in 33 BCE, the Emperor Marcus Agrippa went on a trip all the way down the sewer in a boat rowed by 8 slaves. So this was a huge engineering undertaking. Touring sewers became very popular in the 19th century, as shown by this picture of a large group of elegant Parisian ladies being taken on a trip down the sewers of Paris. The huge sewer under Rome is still in use 2,400 years later. But it was built now it just carries away rainwater from the streets. Incidentally, the Romans used the urine of Portuguese men as a mouthwash, whilst the Greeks used donkey milk. I know which one I prefer. The Roman obsession with cleanliness resulted in some magnificent buildings. For example, the baths at Caracalla in Rome could accommodate over 10,000 people at any one time, and was enormous, as shown by this comparison with the outline of St. Paul's Cathedral at the bottom. The water systems for these baths held the equivalent of 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools. In its glory days, Rome had 1,352 fountains, 144 public toilets, which is far more than there is in London at the moment, and 856 public baths. The city used 6 times as much water per head of the population as modern London. This picture shows a typical Roman communal toilet. The waste was flushed away by a stream of water under the seats. Cleaning was done with a sponge on a stick dipped in vinegar, using the slot at the front of the toilet seat. 2,000 years later, these were the toilets in the Auschwitz concentration camp. What progress has been made in 2,000 years? Moving forward to the time of the Vikings, excavations in York have shown that they emptied their bowels around and even in water wells. From fossilised poo collected and analysed around York, it's been discovered that the Vikings ate cereals, fish and berries, but they also suffered quite severe bowel diseases, which were endemic, including infestations by whipworm, roundworm and moorworm. These worms can migrate to other organs, such as the ears and the nose of the unfortunate sufferers. Maybe that explains why the Vikings were so unpleasantly violent after rowing for weeks on a ship full of men suffering from painful diarrhoea, cramping stomach pains, and orifices full of irritating worms. Before moving on our story to the filth and pestilence of medieval times, I want to introduce the chamber pot, that essential item for avoiding the long walk down the garden in the dark and rain to the privy. In medieval times, a great deal of medical diagnosis was based on the colour and smell of a patient's urine. Urine was collected in glass bottles called Jordans. This was because the Crusaders used to take them out to Palestine and bring back water from the River Jordan in them. This is a typical chart used to identify ailments by looking at urine and smelling it. The Jordans were also used to save getting out of bed to have a pee, and thus were the invention of the chamber pot. Chamber pots have been around for about 2,000 years, and here we see an example of a 3rd century Chinese one and a Japanese one from the 17th century made of wood. Here we see a chamber pot under the bed where a maiden is being ceremonially deflowered whilst the priest looks on. That was fun. The couple in the bed don't seem very happy about this. The pot on the left has a monkey painted on the inside, and the instruction around the outside says, "Keep me clean all week, and what I see I will not tell." Using a chamber pot in Regency times must have been an art with so many skirts, underskirts and crinoline cages. Ladies over many centuries would have had problems with bladder control during church services when priests would happily drone on for 2 hours or more. So the bordeloo was invented for their comfort. They would discreetly hide the bordeloo until needed, slip it under their voluminous dresses, and when they finished peeing, they would pour the contents on the floor. The urine would, over decades, soak the floorboards and produce saltpeter, which is one of the 3 main components in the manufacture of gunpowder. Gangs would go into churches and rip up the floorboards, soaked in stale urine, and sell them to the gunpowder manufacturers for a very substantial profit. In the reign of Charles I, 2 men, Thomas Hilliard and Nicholas Stevens, became saltpeter millionaires by collecting urine-soaked material wherever it could be found. "The women, they piss in their seats, which causes excellent saltpeter," said one of them when taken to court. This was because he was caught digging up the floor of the church at Chipping Norton. And they would load the seats into the churchyard without any permission whatsoever. When they finished up in court, they actually said, "In all places without distinction, as in parlours, bedchambers, threshing floors, malting houses and shops, yea, God's own house, we have not forborne, but have digged in churches, hallowed chapels and churchyards, tearing men's bones and ashes out of their grave to make gunpowder of." The chamber pot was often used for ridiculing politicians and the like. And here we see a cartoon mocking Napoleon, showing him seated on a huge chamber pot. In the 18th and 19th centuries, chamber pots were kept in most rooms, even dining rooms, so that family and visitors could relieve themselves without having to leave the room. The drunkard on the left appears to be having trouble pointing Percy at the porcelain. He's actually missing by quite a bit. It's said that when Beethoven was absorbed in his composing, his chamber pot placed by the piano would overflow and a stream of urine would run across the carpet. Moving on to the history of toilets past Roman times, we have 17 centuries of filth and disease. Whilst the peasants pooed and peed outside their cottages into holes dug in the ground, the wealthy installed garderobes in their castles. And here we see an example. This was a seat over a chute on an outer wall. The human waste slid down either into a moat or onto the ground when the peasants collected it to fertilise their crops. The smell in the garderobe was so bad that the castle inhabitants actually hung their best clothes in there because the clothes moths would not live in the pungent atmosphere. In fact, that's where the word garderobe comes from, guarding your robes. The garderobe was one of the weakest parts of the castle's defence. For example, in 1069, Godfrey the Hunchback, Duke of Lower Lorraine, was killed by an assassin who bravely stood under the garderobe whilst waiting for the Duke to have his daily poo. When the feces started to fall on him, he thrust a long spear up the chute, killing the Duke instantly. No doubt his eyes were watering at the time. History was changed even more dramatically when Martin Luther was sitting on a garderobe, struggling with a particularly painful bowel movement. He was also in mental turmoil because he couldn't choose between whether to marry a wealthy and very sexy young lady or become a monk. In his physical and mental struggles, he cried out to Saint Anne for help. His bowels eased instantly, and in gratitude, he became a monk. And look where that led. One result was that King Henry VIII became a Protestant and founded the Church of England. All because of a bowel movement. And so it is that our gracious late Queen owes her role as head of the Anglican Church to Martin Luther's painful bowel movements. London was typical of all large cities in medieval times. Rivers were used as sewers, and the foul stench and pollution of drinking water caused great illness and loss of life. Cattle, pigs, sheep were brought into London in vast numbers. There were more animals brought in for slaughter than there were citizens. These animals were killed, and the waste was thrown into the streets where they could accumulate up to knee depth. In 1290, the prior of the Carmelite house in Whitefriars complained of the river Fleet's noxious exhalations, the miasma of which had killed many of the hooded brethren, and corruption of which overpowered the odours of the incense. So that was in 1290. The Blackfriars and the Bishop of Salisbury, whose palace was in Salisbury Court, Fleet Road, also signed this petition. In 1355, Edward III set up an inquiry because the dyke next to the Fleet prison was so deep with liquefied human excrement that it was possible to float a substantial boat in it. Jonathan Swift, author of Gulliver's Travels, mentions the filth of the River Fleet in a poem of 1710. Sweepings from butcher's stalls, dung, guts and blood, drowned puppies, stinking sprats, all drenched in mud. Dead cats and turnip tops come tumbling down the flood. Charming. There is an apocryphal story of a pig being driven into London's Camden Market, where I used to live as a child. It slipped and fell into the River Fleet, where it was swept away into a culvert. The farmer sadly watched his young porker disappearing down the culvert. However, a few months later, the same pig appeared at Blackfriars, fit and well and nearly double the size when it was lost. The Fleet's burden of animal intestines and offal, together with copious supplies of human poo, had fattened it up nicely. Right up until the middle of the 19th century, most people used a privy which discharged into a cesspit in the ground, which, when full, was covered over and a new hole was dug nearby. In 1844, no fewer than 53 overflowing cesspits were discovered under Windsor Castle, causing widespread illnesses amongst the servants. Prince Albert set about replacing the commodes that had been carried through the castle to be poured into the holes where everything was free. However, he died in 1861 of typhoid, probably contracted from the overflowing cesspits, just as his grand scheme for introducing flushing toilets was about to start. Queen Victoria, in her widow's grief, ordered everything to stay the way it was in her castles, and the overflowing cesspits remained, resulting in many further deaths of servants and household staff. The cesspits in the towns and cities were emptied by the night soil men, and the excrement was carried away to be dumped in the local rivers by the cartload, or sold to farmers as fertiliser. This gentleman doesn't look very happy at the cart passing him with all the human poo in it. It was traditional for chamber pots to be emptied out of windows onto the street. Pedestrians would shield themselves with umbrellas made of leather. But wealthier residents had what they called closed stools. These were also called commodes, which was named after the Roman emperor Commodus, made famous in the film Gladiator. Despite the abundance of closed stools and chamber pots in royal palaces, there was an awful lot of pooing and peeing done in the hallways, on stairs and against palace walls. For example, the mother of Louis XIV was caught peeing behind a tapestry in Versailles. Livestock was sometimes found wandering around the Grand Gallery at Versailles, not the impression of opulence and grandeur popularly promulgated on television. In 1606, the French Dauphin wrote an edict forbidding anybody from pooing or peeing in the rooms of Versailles, or in the corridors, or on the stairs in the palace of Saint-Germain. This edict was ignored, including by the Dauphin himself, who habitually urinated against the highly decorated walls of his bedroom. Perhaps the pinnacle of peeing cheek was performed by the Count of Guiche, a friend of Louis XIV's, who was caught short during a formal ball in 1658 and actually peed into his dance partner's hand muff. Perhaps the pinnacle, palaces such as Versailles stank of excrement and urine because of the courtiers' habit of peeing and pooing in all the rooms and stairways, despite the many closed stalls that were and the multitude of chamber pots. The garden paths at Versailles and Fontainebleau were scattered with piles of human poo festering away in the hot sun. Sewers were built in the cities, but these were crude and inadequate. Most houses used cesspits. The diarist Samuel Pepys made much use of his admirable closed stool commode. However, he had problems with his neighbour's sewerage system, as he wrote in 1660. And, going down into the cellar to look, I put my foot into a great heap of turds, by which I find that Mr. Turner's house of office is full, and comes into my cellar, which doth trouble me greatly. Mr. Turner, the diarist neighbour, had let his cesspit overflow into Pepys' cellar. Pooing and peeing in the street was actually common practice. When the Albert Hall was built in 1871, no toilets were provided, so that patrons had to go outside and pee and poo in adjacent gardens. It was little wonder that disease was rife due to the contaminated water supplies and the excrement laying around. This chart shows the life expectancy of men in mid-Victorian England. And you can see that for professional tradesmen in Rutland, the average age expectancy was about 52. But if you were a labourer in Bolton, it was only 18. One of the main reasons why life expectancy was so short was because half of the children died before their 4th or 5th birthday. My mother, in fact, had 2 siblings, both of whom died in their first birthdays, before their first birthdays. And the cause of death on their certificates was acute diarrhoea and exhaustion. So even in 1905, when my mother was born, this was still a big problem. Jumping back now to 1596, we come across Sir John Harrington, one of Queen Elizabeth's 102 grandchildren. Sounds very grand to be godchildren. Sounds very grand to have that number of godchildren, 102. He was the inventor of the flushing toilet as we know it today. And this is his patent application. This toilet had all the components of a modern system, namely a cistern to hold the water, a valve to release the water to flush the bowl, and a one-way system to allow the excrement to pass through while shutting out the smell. Unfortunately, although Harrington installed one of these toilets in Queen Elizabeth's palace, the very first royal flush you might say, they never really caught on. One reason might have been that all the flushing water filled up the cesspits much quicker and they cost more to empty. I would say that Harrington's toilet turned out to be a bit of a flush in the pan. Thank you. He had a great sense of humour though. He was quite a lively lad, and you'll see this from the fact that in the cistern of water at the top there, he's put drawings of fish swimming around in there. Not that you would have had fish in real life. Now we go on another 179 years for the next development. Joseph Bramah invented and patented two devices of immense value to humanity. The first practical mass-produced toilet and the beer pump. And neither of those have improved very much over the years. The beer pump that you see in pubs today is exactly the same as Joseph Bramah invented all that time ago. He also invented an unpickable lock, and he offered a prize of £45,000 in today's money to the first person who could pick the lock. This was achieved in 1851 by a visitor to the Great Exhibition, 37 years after Bramah's death. Now that's a lock you really want on your garage door. Bramah also invented a self-sharpening pencil and the hydraulic press. The installation and development of the toilet really took off at this point. Top centre, we see the first toilet that used an S-bend to keep out smells from the sewerage system. Top right is an elaborate type of toilet pan used in Queen Victoria's palaces. Bottom right and the pull chain handle are by Thomas Crapper. The handle on the chain tells users to pull and let go, because high cistern toilets with a chain were a novelty and people just didn't know what to do with them. There's a large and perfectly preserved Thomas Crapper lavatory in Wesley's Chapel and the Lazian Mission in London. I visited a couple of years ago and it's amazing. These pictures that I've shown here are from my visit, the ones with Thomas Crapper on. It's free to visit as well. Just walk in, say, I want to see the Thomas Crapper toilet, please, down the corridor. Having mentioned Thomas Crapper, it's time to dispel a few myths about him. Did referring to poo as crap originate with his name? The word crap actually derives from a group of obsolete dialect words related to the Middle English word crapper, and the Dutch crappen, and the Old French crapper or crappin, all of which refer to the husks and other waste left behind when grinding wheat. It was used in the sense, generally, of something being useless rubbish or waste material. So the word crap was around long before Crapper himself was even born. The first use of the word crap as a vulgar term for pooing was first written in 1846 when Thomas Crapper was just a young child. So the widely held association of his name with the act of going to the loo is false. However, Crapper's name was seen emblazoned on many toilets in late Victorian times. Although throughout the first half of the 20th century, so it's not surprising that this false attribution grew in strength. It's probable that the phrase going to the crapper was invented by American soldiers visiting England during World War I, after they saw Thomas Crapper's name on all the toilet systems. This may have been the way these expressions made their way to the United States, where toilets are still referred to as crappers. Plumbers. Now, plumbers got their name from the Latin name for plumbum, which is for lead, which is what they used in their pipework. Plumbers have gained a possibly unjustified reputation over the centuries for arriving on the wrong day, coming without the necessary tools, flirting with the girls in the household and overcharging for their services. And I think this sort of sums it up. The plumber there is obviously flirting with the young maid, and the householder is not looking at all happy about it. But what can he do? He's dependent on the plumber. The rapidly rising demand for toilets, baths and running water to be installed in the houses of the wealthy in the late 18th century and throughout Victorian times created a demand for plumbers that could not be satisfied, a bit like today. You try and get a plumber out on an emergency visit. Plumbers had a dangerous job. Apart from the consequences of getting serving maids pregnant, they could be blown up by exploring a sewer with a naked flame. They could be attacked and infected by rats, and they could be struck down with many sewerage-borne diseases such as typhoid, dysentery and cholera. I'm going to move on now to the history of toilet paper. As long ago as 1,400 years ago, the Chinese were manufacturing toilet paper. This was produced in large sheets and sold in boxes. By the 1300s, over 1 million packets of toilet paper, each containing over 1,000 sheets, were being produced every year in China. In 1839, over 15,000 sheets were produced annually for the Emperor Hingwu alone. They got through an awful lot of toilet paper in China. Meanwhile, outside China, many things have been used for wiping your bum. Aristophanes' play Plutus has a slave boasting about how his master has risen up the social hierarchy and acquired so much wealth that the slaves no longer have to wipe their arses with stones but have garlic stalks instead. Oh, very upmarket, wouldn't it? In the rest of the world, used old clothing was torn into strips, and in coastal areas, clam and oyster shells were used. In the USA, though, corn cobs were used as early as 1900. Often these would be dyed pretty colours to add ambience to the outhouse. James Whitcomb Riley, a poet in the 1800s, was moved to write this ode in praise of the corn cobs' cleaning qualities. But when the crust was on the snow and sullen skies were grey, in sooth the outhouse was no place where one to stay. We did our duties promptly there, one purpose swayed the mind. We tarried not, nor lingered long for what we left behind. The torture of the icy seat would melt a Spartan's heart, for needs must scrape the goose flesh with a lacerating cob that from a frost-encrusted nail hung pendant by a string. My father was a frugal man and wasted not a thing. In the late 19th century, corn cobs and newspapers rapidly disappeared from the toilets. It was discovered that the Sears and Roebuck catalogue, which started publication in 1894, was ideal for bum wiping. It was given away free, it was thick, and the paper was absorbent. What more can you ask for? And it was also interesting to browse. Despite its admirable wiping properties, it was mocked as the Rears and Sawbutt catalogue. Many publishers of large popular catalogues even provided a hole in the top corner of all pages so that it could be hung in the toilet. The New Yorker, John Gaiety, first produced paper sheets in the USA specifically for wiping your bottom in 1857. It was sold as following: Gaiety's medicated paper, a perfectly pure article for the toilet and for the prevention of hemorrhoids. He was actually severely attacked by the medical profession because he couldn't produce any evidence that his toilet paper prevented hemorrhoids. His toilet paper was made of Manila hemp, which is the same sort of thing they use for making ropes. His rivals advertised their toilet paper as guaranteed from splinters, so it shows what rough it was. I'm going to move on now to describe the huge civil engineering project directed by Sir Joseph Bazalgette, whose memorial stands on the Thames embankment close to the underground station. And I went up there with Sandy a few years ago to find it and photograph it. Between 1820 and 1840, it was estimated that the number of flushing toilets in London had grown by a factor of 10, and 200,000 cesspits had been closed. This put an intolerable strain on the existing sewer system. It also vastly increased the amount of sewerage being carried into the Thames, which would turn it into a stinking and fetid river. The city's drinking water was drawn directly from the Thames, often, as shown in this cartoon, from points where the sewers were discharging raw excrement. So you see the sewers all discharging their muck coming down the side, and in the middle was where the water was being pumped out into the drinking system. Cholera was endemic, with 4 major outbreaks of cholera between 1832 and 1866, which ravaged London communities and led to the deaths of tens of thousands of people. The government set up several commissions which recognised the urgency and the deadliness of the problem, but nothing happened. Sounds familiar. In part, this was because the cost of building a new sewer system for London would have cost over £570 million in today's money. So they weren't going to spend the money lightly. The internationally famous scientist Sir Michael Faraday took a boat trip up the Thames to inspect its condition, and he was appalled. He tested the turbidity of the water by dropping little bits of white paper and measured how far they sank until they became invisible. That distance was 1 inch. Still nothing happened, despite the rapidly growing toll of cholera victims. This was a cartoon in Punch. Dead dogs and cats floating past in the River Thames. This cartoon was also published in Punch magazine after Faraday's report on the trip down the Thames. It shows microscopic life forms infesting a drop of water. The characters were all based on contemporary political and government figures, as well as the aldermen, deputies and common councilmen of London who were being blamed for the terrible and deadly state of London's sewers. So they pulled no punches when they attacked the people who were refusing to produce a decent sewer system. It was not just cholera that was killing people. This picture shows the aftermath of a massive explosion caused by the build-up of methane on the overloaded sewers. The long, hot summer of 1858 created an event that even Parliament could no longer ignore: the Great Stink. The fetid Thames, overflowing with sewerage and dead animals, was creating such an overpowering smell alongside the Houses of Parliament, so much so that parliamentary business was suspended. Sheets soaked in chloride of lime were hung over the windows in a futile attempt to keep out the stench. Sir Joseph Bazalgette was finally given the approval to start his enormous task. It isn't until the parliamentarians are affected that work starts to get done. Just note that. Nothing changes. The first thing he did was to task the Ordnance Survey to produce large maps of London on a scale of 25 inches to 1 mile, showing every house in London and its precise height above the Thames, so that he could plan every connection and make sure the drains would always be at the right angle to flow correctly. This took several years, and then the digging started. The main collecting sewers, marked in green, yellow. The main collecting sewers, marked in yellow, were 82 miles in length, and the smaller connecting sewers totaled 1,100 miles. The sewage mainly fell gradually under gravity to 2 collecting points well downstream of London, shown by the red circles on the right-hand side. At these points, it was discharged into the Thames estuary, untreated. 1 huge pumping station was needed, shown where the blue circle is at Abbey Wood. The scale of this civil engineering task was absolutely enormous. This picture shows the size of the main collecting sewers. This picture shows a remarkable yet relatively small part of the sewer system. It shows the newly created Victoria Embankment in 1867, which included, in addition to a huge underground sewer, an underground steam railway, which became the District and Circle line of the London Underground, as well as gas, electricity and water pipes, all built in one consolidated engineering project. Many areas of London were transformed with huge embankments built alongside the Thames, such as the Albert Embankment, Victoria Embankment, Chelsea Embankment. All of these were built to cover the huge sewers running adjacent to the Thames. Several major bridges over the Thames were built, or existing bridges significantly improved, such as the Albert Bridge, Putney Bridge, Hammersmith Bridge and Battersea Bridge. You can see why this would cost over £500 million in today's money. Major streets in London were greatly rebuilt and improved, including Charing Cross Road, Garrick Street, Northumberland Avenue, Shaftesbury Avenue. Plans were also made for what would become the Blackwall Tunnel and the Tower Bridge. Very ambitious scheme. The cut and cover method was favoured because this was cheaper than tunnelling, but it caused more disruption. The whole project was colossal in scope. It required 318 million bricks to be made and 670,000 cubic yards of concrete to be poured. Inevitably, there were accidents during this enormous project. This picture shows the aftermath of a massive collapse and explosion in one of the sewers that was being built. The sewerage could only be discharged into the Thames downstream, when the tide was ebbing. Otherwise, the sewerage would have gone straight back into London. The sewerage had to be stored for hours and hours, waiting for the tide to ebb, twice a day. This picture shows part of the reservoirs used to store the liquid. Absolutely massive. Sandy and I actually visited this pumping station last year, and all that area is now covered over and become a cricket pitch. 140 million tonnes of sewerage pass through these reservoirs every year. The stations at Crossness, which is the one that we visited, and Abbey Mills were gloriously fitted out and decorated like ancient temples to excrement. Absolutely amazing, the decoration there and the wrought ironwork. You wouldn't think that was for pumping sewerage, would you? Unfortunately, the amount of sewerage discharged on each ebbing tide produced thick layers of excrement where the Thames estuary met the North Sea. So the problem of the stinking Thames had only been moved further out towards the North Sea. In 1878, there was a collision between two ships in this area. One was a very large freight ship which hit and sank a smaller passenger ship. Over 600 people were flung into the water where they wallowed in recently discharged excrement and all drowned. The bodies were recovered over a period of weeks, by which time most of them had bloated with festering sewerage to the point that they would not fit in normal coffins. I do hope you enjoy your mince pies later, after all. Following this tragedy, all sewerage discharged from the two outfalls were loaded onto boats and carried out to be dumped in the North Sea, still untreated, well away from land. This stopped as late as the 1990s. Now, half of London's human waste is incinerated to generate electricity, and the rest is sold as dried pelleted fertiliser to local farms. At the start of the 21st century, Bazalgette's amazing sewers were becoming overloaded because the population of London was now something like 5 times greater than when he designed the sewerage system. There's a new sewerage system being built now alongside the Thames. This is 24 feet in diameter and will run for 16 miles. But all of Bazalgette's 1,100 miles of secondary sewer pipes are still going to be left, and they will still be working. An amazing achievement. The cost of this new project is £4.2 billion. Some abandoned underground toilets have been converted into bars, nightclubs, shops, art galleries, even apartments. Here are a few pictures from toilet conversions that I've actually visited. This is a ladies' and gents' toilet which has been converted into an underground bar. This is an underground nightclub. It looks a bit small, but it even manages to have a glitter ball just as you go into the nightclub, just to get a bit of atmosphere. This is an underground gentleman's toilet, an Edwardian one, which has been converted into a bistro. And I went up there a couple of years ago and had a very nice meal. I sat with my feet in a urinal, eating a sandwich and drinking a coffee. You can see the urinals on the right there have been left, and the Thomas Crapper cistern over your head. They did the owners did actually assure me that the urinals had been scrubbed very well before being used for serving up food. This toilet in South London, WC, has been turned into a wine and charcuterie bar. And I'm going to end the talk now with two rather relevant inventions for the 21st century. Here we see unisex urinals at which men and women can both stand alongside each other if they wish to. Amazing piece of engineering design. And, as any wife will know, men are not always very accurate when they're standing at the urinal. And so you can buy this to entertain them while they're having a pee. It gives men something to aim for to keep the floor dry. I actually photographed this in a very old pub in Somerset, and Sandy wondered why I was in there so long. And I said, well, I was trying to get a hat trick. So, right, thank you very much for that. If you have any questions, I think there might be time, might there?
Yes, we have got time. Before we go to questions, Geoff, I just want to quickly relay a little anecdote that came to me during your talk. Does anyone remember Isle medicated toilet paper? Hands up if you... Yeah, it's quite a few of you. Isle medicated toilet paper was that scratchy sort of, like tracing paper that was supposed to be good for hemorrhoids. Now, my mother used to run a holiday flatlet business in Boston in the sort of 60s and 70s was the real heyday. And the guests upstairs had the Isle medicated toilet paper, but downstairs we had the proper sort of new Andrex soft stuff. So if we ever had to go upstairs, we'd take our own personal toilet paper. But when I asked my mother, so Mum, why do the guests have the Isle medicated, but downstairs we can have the Andrex? And she said, well, if we put Andrex up there, they'd use at least 5 times as much of it as the Isle.
It's true.
So things have moved on. Geoff, that was an absolutely amazing talk. Thank you so much. So,
okay, you're welcome.
Yeah, do we have any questions for Geoff?
Wow.
Okay, Aaron at the back. Do you want to just shout, Aaron?
Yeah, I could just shout. It was the privacy thing. I can see why they moved toilets from doing it in the streets to out of the street. But it seems to be men will just stand in a line, and then everybody else seems to have cubicles. When did the not showing your body parts to another person become a thing?
I would say about Edwardian times, because that bistro that I went to actually had partitions between the people in the urinal. But when I went to the Thomas Crapper toilet, which is, say, up in London, there were no partitions there for the men standing there. They were, well, they could see anything they wanted. It makes me wonder, actually, looking at the penultimate slide there of the unisex urinals at which men and women can both stand up, whether they'll put partitions between those or not. In the picture, they don't have any partitions between them. I'm not sure that's a very good idea.
Well, when people using the phones now, you might need a hand from somebody anyway.
So. Well, yeah.
Has anyone ever used one of those unisex urinals yet? No one here? No. Sally, did you have a question?
Yes, I was wondering.
Just pointed to you, yeah.
I was wondering, in Roman times when they had those magnificent, for the time, public toilets, did they actually have separate ones for women, or were you all in?
Do you know, I don't know that, because I think the Roman bars were pretty much exclusively for men, actually. I've never heard of women using them.
I may be basing it on Lindsay Davis or someone like that. I have a feeling that for the baths there were times when they were available for women and times when they were
that may be true.
But that wouldn't work
Yes.
so well for the toilets, I feel. Whereas
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, or any of the other ancient cultures that had sort of communal.
Would they have separated? I think some were communal, yes. I mean, that particular photograph that I showed there of the Roman toilet, that was taken on Hadrian's Wall, where there is a very good preserved, but of course they were soldiers, so they didn't worry about sitting there and doing anything. Yes, I just mentioned, I keep thinking of anecdotes, and one of them is that, as I said, with the Roman toilets, they clean themselves with a sponge on a stick, dipped in vinegar. And apparently there's a story of a gladiator who decided to commit suicide rather than go in the arena and be torn to shreds by a lion. And he stuffed one of these things right down his throat and choked on it. So do enjoy your mince pies. Yeah.
Thank you. May I ask, what is the difference between a cesspit and a septic tank? I've always wondered about this.
Well, I think it's a matter of time, really, because the cesspits were just holes dug in the ground, whereas a septic tank, there is a lining which contains what's going in there, and so it's pumped out. I mean, a lot of people in the countryside now have septic tanks, and a lorry comes around and pumps it out. But the cesspits were just holes dug anywhere. And there was one story of a big mansion somewhere in the Midlands where they had all these cesspits and they covered them over, and they'd largely forgotten where they were. And they were having a big ball one evening, and a coach with 4 horses drew up with some very big dignitaries in, and the whole lot fell into a cesspit because the top broke, and apparently all 4 horses and the coach and the occupants all went into this cesspit, which they'd forgotten there. So cesspits were just dug all over the place, and certainly at Windsor Castle, as I said, they had 44 cesspits all over the place, down in the kitchen, anywhere where they could dig a hole, they would just dig a hole and pour everything in, and when it was full, put a plank of wood over it or something like that. So I think that's the difference. Septic tanks are much more modern. Yeah.
Well, just to add to that, the cesspits would be self-contained. If you have a cesspit, you have to have it emptied.
Yes.
Whereas with a septic tank, the water flows out of it.
Oh, okay,
so
right.
You have it emptied every so often, but
Yeah.
not as frequently as a
Right.
cesspit.
Right.
You know what I mean, so it's...
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that sounds good.
Can I just add a few more things? A very interesting talk. When I worked at Thames Water, the ships that went down the Thames were called Bovril boats.
That's right, Bovril boats, yeah.
They jollop out into the North Sea.
Into the North Sea, yes.
And anybody who wants to see the River Fleet, if you're like me and a complete idiot, if you go to the Metropolitan Line station under King's Cross and Pancras, walk to the eastern end, you'll find a big metal box going over your head.
Yeah.
That is the River Fleet.
That is the River Fleet, yes. It's
going down.
That's right. It comes down, goes up over a pipe and comes down again, doesn't it? Yeah.
But the other thing that interests me is that until about in the 1850s, things like cholera were thought to there were no connection with water. They were thought to be caused by
miasma theory. Yeah, that's right.
And there was a famous doctor called Dr. John Snow who went into Soho, and there were outbreaks of cholera, and he chained up several pumps, water pumps, and the incidence of cholera suddenly dropped.
Plummeted, yes.
And they worked out that it was the water that was transmitting the cholera and not the miasma. And that was one of the great advances in public health that suddenly occurred by this quite interesting observation.
That's right.
And action. You know.
I can add 2 things to that, actually. That first of all, Florence Nightingale, up until her death, believed the miasma theory, even long after it had been disproved. And she died an old lady, which is amazing. It just shows some ideas die with the person; they don't get disproved. The other thing, you say the River Fleet. The primary school I went to during the war in London was called Fleet Road School, and it was called that because the River Fleet ran under the playground. and there was a grating in the playground, and if you looked into it, you could see the River Fleet flying under the playground. So, yeah, I know the River Fleet quite well.
Well, it starts up on Hampstead.
It starts in the Vale of Health in Hampstead Heath and comes down. But where it came under the school, though, it wasn't yet a sewer. It becomes a sewer later on. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So you're alive today.
And Geoff, you said that the pig, at one stage in your talk, you said the pig really thrived going into the...
Yes, so the story goes.
But all of the humans died and were bloated afterwards. So is there any scientific explanation for the fact that the pig was fine and the humans weren't?
I think that pigs have a reputation for eating anything, don't they? If you want to keep a pig, it's one of the easiest animals to keep in the garden. It will eat anything. I think its digestive system is more suited to the sort of things it was picking up in the culvert and down the sewer. And I can't imagine any of us dropping into a sewer and coming out a couple of weeks later healthier than we were when we went in. So.
Do we have any more questions of Margaret?
It's just to go back to the Romans and the sponge on a stick. I think that's the origins of the expression to get the wrong end of the stick.
Yes. There are lots of sayings like that. I'm just trying to remember one of them that comes from the Navy. I can't remember it, but never mind. But yes, that is true. You've got the wrong end of the stick. If you've got your hand on the sponge before it had gone into the vinegar pot, yes, you did get the wrong end of the stick. Yes.
I was interested that you said that some of the excrement is made into pellets.
Yes, it is now, yes. Yeah.
My friends were caretaking an island off of Mull, and they had earth toilets, and they were cleared, and they said, we grow our own food, but the powers that be will not allow us to use it. You know, it's actually, they were all vegans and organic food, so
yes.
It was probably as pure as it gets.
Yeah.
But did they treat the pellets before they...
Yes, they do. Yeah, I think they use ultraviolet light to sterilise them. Yeah, because a lot of in medieval times the peasants would, as I said, they go and stand under the garderobe, at the castle. They dig out all the human poo and take it away, put it on the fields. But this was actually not very good, and it did cause a lot of disease. But yes. I remember, again, I keep going off on these tangents, but I worked at Winfrith in the 1960s, and they had their own sewerage works, and they used to take the sewage, the dried sewage, and put it all on the grass. And sometimes we'd be walking out there eating our lunch and suddenly find ourselves with human manure all around us at Winfrith. So, yeah, it's still used as a fertiliser. Yeah, waste nothing.
And Geoff, when we drive into Bournemouth, there's always that rather sort of pooey sort of smell coming into Bournemouth. I mean, will we ever advance beyond that sort of pooey smell coming into Bournemouth, do you think?
I don't know. We've got a big sewerage works in Weymouth, which is totally enclosed in concrete, but you can still smell it for about half a mile away. No, you'll always smell sewerage works, I think. Yeah.
Okay, do we have any more questions?
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed your talk.
Thank
I
you.
understood you were going to touch a bit on the future about the space travel and how...
Yes, I did. I cut that bit out, I'm afraid, because I was worried about the time. But yes, if you plug for my book, I've got some photographs in there of the equipment. And in the old days, in the first spacecraft, the equipment they used for going to the toilet wasn't unisex. And when the first woman, Sally Ride, went up there, this caused her quite a lot of problems, especially in zero gravity. So on the International Space Station now, they do have separate toilets for the men and the women. And particularly for the women, it has to be designed to fit quite comfortably around her private areas, so that all the urine is sucked away and doesn't get into all the electronics in the spacecraft. Very complicated system. Yeah, you don't want little droplets of urine floating around in a spacecraft, do you? So, yeah, I cut that bit out.
And I'll come to you, Anne, in just a second. Up at the university campus, I've noticed there are, in one of the buildings there, Talbot House, there's there's a number of toilets which are, you put the lid down and you press a button and there is this kind of sucking sound. And
Right.
And it seems to be saving water or something.
Yes,
So-
that's right. Yeah, I don't know how they work, but
No, I don't
there are
know.
toilets around these days that use a lot less water, but I'm not sure. I might mention, incidentally, also another anecdote. Sandy and I went to the Corn Exchange in Dorchester about a year ago, and we both wanted to go to the loo, and somebody had put placards over the ladies and the gents, and it said, "These toilets have been liberated from the sexual binary." And we, right. And we tried to remember, didn't we, which used to be the ladies and which used to be the gents, but released from the sexual binary. It's all going to happen.
When I lived in Rome, I used to spend weekends at Ostia Antica.
Oh, right.
And there they had the most brilliant loos,
Yes.
all set out. And I have a recollection of somewhere where people used to go around in a circle, looking outwards.
Oh, right, okay.
And simultaneous.
I'm not aware of that one.
But it was all in Italy, and
Yes.
associated with Ostia Antica. I suppose if people wanted to see how magnificently
Oh, sounds like a good idea.
still there, but no idea.
No, I haven't heard of that one. No.
And there's another thing where people used to rely on the railway to take it away. They'd all sit with their backs
Yeah,
to the railway line, and it would
yeah.
somehow fast trains would.
Oh, yeah, this is the flying toilet. This is used a lot in Kenya in particular, I know, where you poo into a plastic bag and then throw it on the railway line. And I was reading, and it's in my book, a story about a train, a goods train that was actually derailed because of the amount of plastic bags full of poo that were on the railway line, and the driver of the train was killed, sadly. So, yeah, there's all sorts of ways of getting rid of the stuff.
Not as efficient as
No.
they have.
Well, not getting rid of it, just passing it somewhere else, actually. Yeah. It's called a flying toilet.
Oh, I'll just shout. Talking about getting rid of it, I want to briefly explain how a sewage works.
Oh, goodness. It's a long story. There was a programme on television about 6 months ago about a modern sewage works up in the Midlands, and it was absolutely fantastic. And all the processes that it has to go through, and it finishes up as drinking water at the end, but it's amazing. And one thing that particularly fascinated me, there was a microbiologist lady there, and they said there are these things called phages, which are like viruses, and they attack bacteria. And they think that this is going to be the way to get round resistance in antibiotics. And she's collecting these phages from the sewerage and actually breeding them, and it's going to be big business, I think, processing sewerage for antibiotics.
Yes, in a nutshell, the sewerage is actually sprayed over a bed of rocks, and the bed of rocks contains an unimaginable amount of bacteria
Oh, yes,
and
yes.
worms and bugs. And the metabolism in there is so great that in covered sewage works, it's about 90 degrees,
Yeah.
being in one. And you look at the rocks and they're absolutely covered in crawling, squirming things that are
Yeah.
basically eating the poo. and
Yeah, that's
producing
right, yeah.
heat.
They love it.
So they should do tours of these things.
Well, yes. I say Sandy and I have done the tour of Crossness pumping station, and it was magnificent. It really was. Yeah. If anybody's up in the London area, do go and visit. They do conducted tours, so excellent.
I'm just going to make a comment. It was a burgeoning new science of tracing diseases upstream through the sewage systems. In the COVID pandemic, they were actually able to detect detect it in the sewage works and then
Yes.
follow upstream to find particular areas and districts where they were having outbreaks.
Yes, that's right. And they're doing it now, looking for drugs in sewers as well. You can detect minute quantities of cocaine and all sorts of Class A, Class B drugs in sewerage, and trace it back probably to the house where it was coming out. So, have to be careful these days.
Any more questions for Geoff? Yes, there you go.
So I'm wandering around because I'm quite deaf, so I have to be close.
Just one very brief one. You did say during your speech you were going to tell one or two anecdotes about toilet adventures on aeroplanes. I'd like to hear them.
Oh, you wouldn't want to know. You Google it, I would say. Oh yes, there was one story of one lady who had 2 feet of her intestines sucked out, but I wasn't going to mention that.
So it really is pretty dangerous to sit on the aeroplane toilet when you press the button. You shouldn't press the button.
Only if you're very fat, because they do have the gap in the front to avoid that. But apparently this particular lady was extremely fat, and she covered the whole toilet seat and the pan and made a vacuum tight seal, so it wasn't nice. I think she did actually, yes. It nearly turned her inside out, I'll tell you.
Want to die after that.
Okay, Aaron, yes, Joe.
Yeah, I was just wondering how many varieties of toilets there are, because Chinese have a completely different one, and they have that squat one, don't they?
Yes.
There are other varieties we're not aware of that you might have come across.
Oh yes, yes, of course. During the Victorian times, of course, you didn't have much choice in toilets. They all had Thomas Crapper's name on. I don't think I actually mentioned it, but Thomas Crapper didn't really invent anything. He was what you'd nowadays call a venture capitalist. He would look at people who's got good ideas and he'd fund them and he'd their invention and put his name on the invention. But Thomas Crapper didn't really do very much at all. But they were fairly uniform until, well, the 20th century, and started changing colour and doing things like that. But I was reading the other day that the Japanese have now got a toilet which is Bluetooth enabled. And it comes with a remote control, does everything. Just don't press the wrong button at the wrong time, I think.
Apparently the Oriental ones, because they're all squat, it's easy to go.
Oh, yeah.
Rather than the sitting ones, which
Yeah.
close you up a bit, apparently.
Yes, there is an optimum, experiments have been done, there is an optimum pose to have when you're sitting on the toilet, but I won't go into details. I'm not going to demonstrate, no. But yeah, people have done this because they've noticed that in poor countries where people just crouch, they often have fewer intestinal problems and have better bowel movements than people who actually sit on toilets in the West. We actually sit in the wrong position for aligning all the bits and pieces. So you should really crouch. Yeah.
And we still say pull the flush in our household. When we don't pull it.
No, you press it.
We press it.
Yeah, that's
but
right.
To say
yeah.
press the flush sounds wrong somehow, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
When will someone come up with a formula for architects that will prevent there always being queues outside of ladies' loos in public?
Wow, there we are. Yeah. I was horrified the other day. We went to the Weymouth Pavilion in Weymouth for a show, and there was a queue outside the gentleman's toilet. I never heard of that. It's not right.
Get into heavy metal concerts.
No, I think when it's widespread that they have these unisex stand-up urinals, well, there won't be any queues because the women and the men can all go in and just stand alongside each other, can't they? So that'll solve that problem.
Yeah, I would just add to that. A few years ago, we went to, about this time of the year, we were in the Sydney Opera House, and I thought, oh, this place is so magnificent, there must be great provision for women as for men.
Yeah.
But at the half time, it was just as bad as anywhere else.
Yeah.
It was just hopeless. For the women in particular, they were all
Yeah.
Just flooding in the public, no, not flooding, that's a wrong word. In the public area, should I put it that way?
Well,
In Sydney Harbour, maybe.
Yeah.
They're just going in public,
Remember what I said, when they built the Albert Hall, they didn't have any public toilets in there. If you wanted to go to the loo at half time, you had to go out and go in somebody's front garden or find an alleyway or something like that. So the first public toilets were actually in the Great Exhibition of 1851. And 500,000 people used them, and they charged a penny a go, which in those days was very expensive. That's where the expression comes from. I'm going to spend a penny, of course. It came from the Great Exhibition of 1851. And a couple of years ago, they were doing some work in Hyde Park, and they actually accidentally found one of these toilets. It had been covered over and forgotten about, and there was the original toilet from 1851. So, yeah.
Go ahead,
The unisex toilets, are they blow dry? I'm just wondering if...
Are they what? Sorry?
Are they blow dry, or are they got a bigger...
Oh, well, but do you want me to go back and show you the picture? Oh, there it is, yes, that's the one. Yeah, they're the unisex urinals for men and women.
So they take toilet paper, I'm guessing, then?
Yeah, I don't know how they work. I'll try one and let you know.
Yeah.
But I would assume that they would put modesty screens between them if men and women are both going to be using those. I would hope so anyway. Yeah.
Any more? Okay, well we can finish Q&A a little bit early, if that's all right for your timing, Kathy.
I thought you were... Are we having drinks now? That's fine.
I can tell you a few more stories if you want.
We haven't drinks now and then, speak.
Yes, yeah, I mean, okay, yeah, I'm just... Okay, great. Geoff, are you the world expert now on this topic, would you say?
No. Oh, no. When I was researching my book, I bought lots of books. I have a bookcase about that much in books on toilets and toilet paper. There are books written entirely on the development of toilet paper and things like that. It's a huge book writing thing. I've just sort of pulled a lot of these books together.
And how did you become interested in it?
That happened a long time ago when my father-in-law gave me a book on the development of the toilet. This was back in the early 90s, I think it was, and I found this book fascinating. And the subject sort of went very slowly in my mind for a couple of decades, and then I thought, oh, this is something, I'll write a book about it. And that's how it all happened. It was about 25 years in gestation, I would say. But yes, it was Clean and Decent was the title of the book. Yes, that's right. Yeah, Clean and Decent.
So, Geoff, your partner Sandy is here today. I'm wondering, Sandy, if this subject matter has kind of driven you mad over the years, or have you been a bit careful?
That's the title you put on paper. Three leaves, yeah.
Okay.
Now the water boards use it, don't they? Just put 3 leaves on top.
Okay, well look, will you please join me in giving Geoff a massive round of applause? And before you all start going anywhere, let me just Geoff with
thank you.
Wine. Okay. It's not
thank you very much.
It's definitely wine. And just a couple of things before we go on to our sort of part 2.